So the issue of personal identity comes in both with reincarnation and with the Christian idea of heaven and hell. So we're just going to talk about that a little bit here. Lynn Rudder Baker argues that life after death must include three factors: identity, so the same person must persist after death in some fashion; embodiment, so you must have some kind of spiritual body or some kind of body; and miracle, she says, because life after death is not a natural condition, but she says it's a God-given condition. So she argues that the best way to understand the way persons persist after death, on the Christian view, is the constitution theory of personal identity. So on this version of personal identity, having a first person's perspective is the key to personal identity. So animals lack personal identity, even though they might have beliefs and desires, because they don't have a robust idea of themselves as an I. So, according to Baker, then persons must be embodied in some way or another. So, on this constitution theory, we are constituted by but not identical to our bodies. So, a statue, she says, is constituted by the bronze of which it is made, but it's not identical to it because the statue is something over and above just the lump of bronze. So in a world without art, she said, it would just be a piece of metal. So it's been given some significance and made into perhaps something different than just the metal. Now, unlike a statue, of course, our bodies change over time and we can still be constituted of them. But then there's kind of a weird fine line, because if our bodies change too much, like if slowly, she says, Smith's body became a turnip over time, Smith would not longer be the same person. And you can already see how this might cause problems for the idea of an afterlife. So she rejects Descartes' assumption that we can imagine ourselves without a body. She said we really can't. But life after death is still possible, since we can and must have some kind of spiritual body in the afterlife. And she said that God can decree that Smith is the person in a certain resurrected body in the afterlife. But she doesn't really believe in material souls, so it's unclear what sense or much virtue of Smith has the first person perspective they did in their earthly body. Because we're more than just our bodies, and she admits this, we're not just bodies. Even if we have a body in the afterlife, then we still haven't really answered with this constitution theory what is the I. And there's an appeal to miracle here, but it's not really clear what's going on. So, but Baker argues that, well, this is part of it, that life after death is going to be mysterious because it's a miracle from God. Kevin Corcoran argues against this, that he says, look, even the constitution theory is susceptible to the problem of continuity of bodies, because if the body persists in some way after death, how does this happen when we can see the bodies decay on Earth? I mean, your body does not persist. And constitutionalists, dualists, and materialists all face the same problem, he said, of explaining the numerical identity or the sameness of our bodies before and after death. So St. Thomas Aquinas, of course, did believe in the soul. And he thought that somehow the soul organizes matter around it to form the body, and that the soul persisting after death provides the continuity for personal identity to continue. And this may be more what most people think about when they think of life after death. But Corcoran argues that Aquinas' view fails to account for how the soul persists after the body decays, and in what sense the same body is resurrected in heaven once a person dies. So even if the body is changed or somehow, as they used to say, glorified after death, for the person to persist, it must somehow be the same. So the idea that he doesn't buy the idea that God could, he says that if God made a whole new sort of spiritual body for us that we didn't have before, then there's a sense in which we wouldn't be the same person. And again, Aquinas too thought that somehow there had to be a sameness in order to keep that personal identity. So there's also the resurrection by reassembly view, which is that God takes parts of the body, let's say atoms and like the really small particles, and reassembles them into a heavenly body after death. But this is kind of weird, in part because, as we know, our bodies change a lot over time, and there's no particular reason why God should choose the atoms that compose your body at the time of death. God could also have reassembled your body using the atoms that composed it when you were 10 years old. And part of this just comes into the whole problem with the body theory of personal identity in general, that the body theory is the idea that we're the same as long as we have the same body, but we don't have the same body over time in a real sense, because the cells are constantly dying and being replaced, and in a Shipathesia sort of way. The Shipathesis is the idea, what if you took the boards from a ship one at a time and replaced them, and then the ship was rebuilt? Would it be the same ship? And it's the same with our bodies, right? The cells keep getting replaced over time, and there's a sense in which it's just really a whole new body pretty quickly. So there isn't a really principled sameness between our bodies at any particular time, which makes the body theory of personal identity rather difficult. But also anything like the Constitution or this reassembly theory that says that in some ways our body is important to our personal identity. So if it's possible for God to use either the atoms from when we were 10 or when we died to reassemble us, which presumably God could do either one, since God is omnipotent, there's no privileged reason to think that that body or the body God reassembles at the time of your death is really yours. Which one is the same? And if you're having a numerical sameness, which means that something really is the same instead of a qualitative sameness where, okay, it shares some properties, right? So I can have two watches that look the same. They're qualitatively the same. Let's say they look exactly the same, but they're not numerically the same watch because there's two of them. So this problem of personal identity is saying, look, it's not just that we want to, in some sense, have some of the same properties over time. For personal identity is numeric identity, so we are exactly the same in the sense that there's one of us and there continues to be one of us, and there's a continuity between that one and the one that exists now. So if you have this reassembly theory, there's no right answer about which body is yours, which one is numerically yours, and so the personal identity or numerical identity with your body is just lost at this point. So Corcoran argues that the theory of reassembly seems to violate the idea that for something to be the same, it must have a causal persistence over time. So if God has to reassemble the atoms from whichever body that God chooses in order to make the same body, that reassembly has created a break in the causal connection between the body at the time of death and the body at the time of resurrection. And we generally think if there's a break in the causal connection, then you no longer have numerical identity. So it violates the idea that something is numerically the same only if it's causally connected to itself through time. And again, as we already mentioned, there's a problem with the body being composed of molecules that were once part of other people's bodies or part of the ecosystem. How do we say that these are my atoms when they're part of me now, but they may not be tomorrow, and they weren't part of me before? So this idea that the body is constantly changing, and seems to be a problem for any theory of personal identity that's centered around the sameness of our material constitutions, which is why a lot of people don't really subscribe to the body theory of personal identity anymore. For the same reason, we have problems with the persistence of bodies to the afterlife, or even personal identity to the afterlife. So this is a problem. And we're going to end with this here, though this is not the end of the book, and you should read the last section, but this is the end of our lecture series.